All right, here we go. Worry versus peace, part 2, Matthew 6. No, I'm not in a cave. This is my garage. I tried to record outside earlier with some really cool scenery in the park, and it got interrupted like 6 times. So I gave up, came back in here. So hopefully this works out better. I want to tell you about this illustration I've heard used before we jump into Matthew 6 and keep going with what Jesus says about worry. I don't know if you've ever been on a treadmill or if you've seen someone else run on a treadmill. Fortunately, what I'm about to tell you that I saw happen twice actually has never happened to me. It almost did one time. I was able to avoid it. But there have been 2 times where I have seen people on a treadmill get going extremely fast. I mean, they are sprinting and I'm blown away at their speed. And I'm kind of feeling insecure. I'm like, wow, that person is way faster than I am. And then what you see as this treadmill just keeps spinning is you see this person slowly realize that they're unable to keep running at the speed that they have committed to. And before they're able to stop it or get out of it or jump off or something, they end up tripping and falling hard because they can't keep up with the speed that they've committed to on this treadmill. And if you've ever seen someone fall on a treadmill, it is a bad fall. And I started thinking about that, and I think that that is such a great picture of what a lot of us experience in our world today. And what I mean by that is that I think a lot of us, almost from the time when we're born, it's like we're put on this treadmill and we're just sprinting hard. We're sprinting fast, trying to achieve things, trying to be successful, trying to fit in, trying to get people to like us. The list goes on and on, but we just go fast and hard our whole lives trying to earn things and achieve things and get to the next thing where we can just keep running fast to where we can earn the next thing and keep going fast. And while working hard is not a bad thing at all, that is a great thing. What ends up happening is this cycle that we're on, this treadmill lifestyle, ends up causing us to be extremely hurried and to be extremely worried. And that was not an intentional rhyme, that just happened as it was. But we end up being so hurried, we're so busy, and we end up worrying so much because we are sprinting, trying to achieve the next thing and trying to continue to go and keep up with everybody else. And while it's great to work hard, the problem with that is it prevents us from living in to certain scriptures like Psalm 46:10 that says, "Be still and know that I am God." So we end up living extremely worried and hurried lives. And like we talked about last week, the good news is that Jesus speaks right into our situation when we're dealing with worry and when we're dealing with fear and anxiety. And last week, looking at Matthew 6, I gave the first 2 principles that Jesus teaches us about how can we experience peace when we're worried and when we're sprinting in this world. And today what I want to do is I want to give us 2 more quick principles from Matthew 6 about experiencing peace in the midst of the treadmill, in the midst of the worry. So here we go. We're going to pick it up in verse 27. This is what Jesus says, Matthew 6, verse 27. He asks a question. He says, "And which of you by being anxious can add a single hour to his span of life?" So I love this. One of the things that makes Jesus probably the best teacher that ever lived is Jesus was a master at asking great questions. In fact, that was one of the biggest strategies that he would use to teach, is he would ask really good questions. And what happens is, as a teacher, when you ask a question, it causes the listener in the audience to really think through that question. So what he's caused us to do is he's saying, hey, when you're worrying, what good does that accomplish? And when you start thinking about that, what good has me worrying and being freaked out actually accomplished in my life? What we slowly begin to realize is that worrying actually doesn't accomplish anything. In fact, worry is a complete waste of time. And that's the 3rd principle to help us experience peace in the midst of a worried world, is to realize that worry is actually a waste of time. See, here's the thing. Life is already short. Life is already short. In Psalm 139, it says that God knows how many days we're going to have before we're even born. Life is short, and we're not in control of so many things. So by worrying, actually what we're doing, whether we realize it or not, is we are trying to take on God's job. We are taking on what is his responsibility, which is to run and rule the world. And we're putting that on ourselves and we're trying to do it for him. And what Jesus is saying is when you think about that, when you reflect on that, you realize that worrying is a waste of time because I'm not in control of so many things. And I don't have the ability to do God's job for him. And not only is worry a waste of time, worry can actually shorten our time. The more and more I'm worried, I'm not adding any days to my life. I'm not helping my life. I'm actually hurting my life. In a lot of cases, the more I worry, the more it actually hurts my physical health. And it can actually shorten my life. So what Jesus is saying is when you reflect on this, we realize that worrying is really a waste of time. It doesn't accomplish anything. Ultimately, what worry really is worry is believing that God is not going to get it right. So I try to put myself in his place because I think I have to do his job for him. All right. So what do we do with that? If worrying is a waste of time, what are we supposed to do with that? That leads me to the fourth principle that Jesus talks about when it comes to worrying and experiencing peace in this world. This is verses 28 through 30. Listen to what he says here. He says, "And why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith?" Okay, so we have lilies. We have this guy named Solomon. What's Jesus talking about? It's kind of random. Well, if you remember last week, we talked about how Jesus does this weird thing where when we're worried, he says, hey, go look at the birds. The birds are not worried. And this time he does something similar. He says, hey, look at the lilies of the field. Consider them. That means examine them carefully. Okay, now what he's probably referring to in that time where he even gave this sermon is he was probably referring to flowers, these wildflowers that would have been in the field growing. Okay, now this is what he's saying is that God is so good that he covers the ground with beautiful wildflowers. Now these wildflowers don't even last long. They don't even really contribute much. They're thrown in the fire, but they're beautiful. And God is so good that he even clothes the grass of the field with these beautiful flowers. Then he mentions Solomon. Now Solomon, if you know anything about him, he is one of the wealthiest people to ever live in human history. He was the king of Israel a long time ago. He's one of the wealthiest people to live in human history. Okay, now this is what I think Jesus is saying. I think what Jesus is saying is that not even Solomon, one of the wealthiest kings of all time, was able to use his own resources to clothe himself more beautiful than God can clothe a field with flowers. In other words, not even my best attempts and my highest level of wealth can clothe myself to the degree of beauty that God can clothe a field of grass with wildflowers. And here's the reality. Like, wait, what does that even mean? What does that even have to do with me? I think this is what it has to do with you and me, is that a lot of us are spending our time trying to be like kings. What I mean by that is we're spending our time trying to be in control, trying to earn things for ourselves, trying to make ourselves look really good, get as wealthy as we can, use all of our resources for our good. And I think what God is saying is that what we need is to not try to live like kings. What we need is a relationship with the King of Kings. And when we realize that God is so good that he clothes the grass of the field in a beautiful way, will he not also take care of us? One guy says this about this passage. He says, our Heavenly Father knows our circumstances. And if we will focus on him instead of our circumstances, that's when we're going to grow spiritually. That's when we're going to experience peace in the midst of crazy situations. So what do we do with that? What even is the fourth principle? This is what I think it can help, how it can help us in our lives today. There's this guy named Jonathan Edwards. He was a preacher in the 1700s, and he gave this sermon one time. I just read it again yesterday. I think he says something that's extremely helpful. And if you've been around me at all in my teaching, you've heard this idea before. I say this all the time because I think it's so important, especially where we live in Dallas. But this is what Jonathan Edwards says. Jonathan Edwards talks about honey, all right, the food honey. And he says this, there is a difference between knowing that honey tastes sweet and actually tasting honey for yourself. And I think the same thing is true of our relationship with God. And that's exactly what Jonathan Edwards is saying. He's saying it's one thing to know that there is this heavenly Father who is also the King of Kings. It's one thing to know that the God who even clothes the grass of the field with beautiful flowers is your loving Father who has promised to take care of you. It's one thing to know that in your mind, but it's another thing to truly sense that in your heart. And what I really believe is what we need most right now in the season we're in. It's not a sense of security that comes from fleeting worldly things like my bank account or making sure I have all my plans lined up or what other people think about me, or you can fill in the blank with whatever, but it's a sense of security that comes from God, knowing our loving Father is the King of Kings, and that is unshakable even in the craziest situations of life. So that's the fourth principle to peace. I'm going to put it in terms of a question. What would it look like in this season that we're in to position yourself to sense, not just know, but to sense the greatness of your loving Father who is also in control of all things? Not just to know it in your mind, but to truly sense it in your heart. The reality is none of us can force that for ourselves, but what we can do is we can position ourselves to allow God to give us a sense of his greatness so that we don't just know in our heads that the King of Kings is also our loving Father who has promised to provide for us, but we truly sense it in our hearts. That's what we need. So what can we do? I think it actually takes us back to the treadmill thing, is that we're in this season where things have slowed down a lot and we're not as much on this crazy treadmill. What we can do is we can disconnect and we can be still and know that he is God. We can spend time with our loving Father who is also the King of Kings. And the more and more we are in his presence, the more and more we are listening to his voice, I think the more and more we're going to gain a sense, not just a knowledge, but a sense that really comes from knowing that he is secure, he is in control, and he loves us. And that's my prayer for us today. All right, so we'll be back next time with the last one in worry versus peace.